Okay, good evening. Welcome to Cambridge Forum on this chilly, chilly night as we continue our 47th season of lively and thought-provoking discussions on the vital issues of the day here at First Parish. I'm Pat Zerke, the director of Cambridge Forum, and I am delighted to welcome you to this program with Nathaniel Philbrick, discussing the crisis of leadership in revolutionary America. I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for this event, and we had a lot of help from the National Park Service, the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, and Boston National Historic Park, which is the custodian of the Bunker Hill Monument, the Cambridge Historical Society, and then the moving force behind the event, the Friends of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, and the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati. So please join me in thanking our co-sponsors. There is information about Cambridge Forum on the table in the foyer where you came in. There's also information about the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. And there is a form on that table to which you can add your name, your address, your email address if you would like to receive information about Cambridge Forum's future programs or a podcast of tonight's program or a link to a podcast of tonight's program. There is also information about our support organization, the Friends of Cambridge Forum, and we have been able to present these programs here in Harvard Square for 47 years due to the generosity of our friends, and you are all friends or potential friends, so we thank you very much as well. We do have copies of Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution, available for sale and signing after the program, courtesy of Harvard Bookstore. They're at the table in the front, and Nathaniel will be happy to sign a copy for you. Our moderator tonight is J.L. Bell, a writer who specializes in the start of the American Revolution in New England. He maintains the Boston1775.net website and is particularly interested in the experience of children in revolutionary America. Bell recently completed a major study for the National Park Service on General George Washington's work in Cambridge during the Siege of Boston, and Bell also serves as administrator for the Friends of the Longfellow House, Washington headquarters. As you know, Cambridge Forum's public programs are recorded and then edited and produced as half-hour radio programs, aired on nationwide network of national public radio stations. Podcasts of our forum are available. Sign up on that list and back. Remember, I told you about it earlier. And in addition, tonight's program is being video recorded and will be available on YouTube. Because our programs are recorded, we ask that you come forward during the Q&A part of the program. When you have your question, you come forward to this microphone here in the center aisle so that your question in your voice can be recorded as well as the speaker's answer. And of course, by coming forward, you're giving us permission to record you, edit you, broadcast you, webcast you, podcast you. Somebody might even jog with you along the Charles someday. So we record everything, but there is one thing we do not want to record, and you all know what that is. That is the ringing of your cell phone or other electronic device. So this is a good time to turn them off, or at least silence them. And here is our moderator to introduce the speaker and the topic.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Bunker Hill and the crisis of leadership in revolutionary America. I'm J.L. Bell, a historian of the American Revolution, and I'll be your moderator tonight. The Battle of Bunker Hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts on June 17, 1775 was the bloodiest battle of the American Revolution and the point of no return in the colonial rebellion. The engagement exposed leadership problems for both the victorious British and the losing American forces, and stirred up bitter arguments that echoed for decades. Even as that fighting took place in Boston, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was choosing a new commander. George Washington arrived here in Cambridge to take command of the troops on July 2nd. Who were the leaders in place on that hot day back in June? What new qualities of leadership did Washington bring to the American army outside Boston? Those are a couple of the questions that Nathaniel Philbrick addresses in his new book, Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution, which is the focus of our discussion. Nathaniel Philbrick is a leading authority on the history of Nantucket Island and a popular author on other parts of the American national saga. He serves as director of the Egan Institute of Maritime Studies and is a research fellow at the Nantucket Historical Association. Philbrick has authored or edited more than 10 books for adults and children on sailing, Nantucket history, and Massachusetts history. His book, In the Heart of the Sea, won the 2000 National Book Award for nonfiction, and Mayflower was a finalist for the 2007 Pulitzer Prize. He has appeared on NBC Today Weekend, A&E's biography series, and National Public Radio, and has served as a consultant for the movie Moby Dick, shown on the USA Network. Nat Philbrick's latest book, Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, a Revolution, which received the 2013 New England Book Award for nonfiction, combines telling details and dramatic moments to tell the story of the first real battle of the American Revolution. Please join me in welcoming to the Cambridge Forum, Nathaniel Philbrick.
Well, thank you, John. It is really great to be in this building on this historic patch of earth where so much happened in the past and continues to happen in the present. And it's really great to be here to speak to you about the crisis of leadership in revolutionary America. Most of what I will have to say will be devoted to the discussion with John Bell, but before we get to that, I'd like to start with a brief account of what I encountered while writing Bunker Hill. Despite the title, Bunker Hill is not strictly a battle book. Instead of the focal point, the Battle of Bunker Hill is the turning point in the story of how the community of Boston responded to the collective trauma of a revolution. When I think about it, all of my books are about communities enduring enormous stress, whether they be the crew of a whale ship rammed by a whale, an outpost of pilgrims marooned in the American wilderness, or a regiment of cavalry trapped on a hill overlooking the Little Bighorn River. I guess I'm most interested in examining what kind of leaders emerge from these communities and what are the consequences of the decisions those leaders make. The leader who dominates the first part of Bunker Hill is Samuel Adams, the man who did more than anyone else to make the revolution an inevitability. Samuel Adams was an organizer, a thinker, and a conniver, a Puritan of the Enlightenment with a genius for finding the way to spread the word. I'd like to quote from my description of Samuel Adams and the decision he made in the fall of 1772 that, to my mind, put into motion the forces that would eventually lead to a revolution in Massachusetts. And this is from my book, Bunker Hill. He was 51, but with his gray hair and trembling hands, he seemed much older. He had a resonant singing voice, a distrust of horses, and a giant Newfoundland dog named Q that hated British soldiers. He had failed at every business venture he had ever attempted, but he had one extraordinary talent. He understood, in a deeply historic sense, the future. America had been founded by immigrants who, like little thanks to their mother country, had made a life for themselves in a distant land. And now the mother country wanted to assert her right to control the descendants of those immigrants. But there was a blatant absurdity attached to this claim. England was a tiny island on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. America was a vast continent with a population that doubled every 20 years and that would soon include more English people than lived in all of Britain. No matter how strong the ties between America and England, this fundamental fact could not be ignored. Samuel Adams lived and inhabited this truth. He invested it with the spiritual fervor of his Puritan ancestors, but with an essential difference. Where the Puritans had seen God's will lurking behind the seeming disorder of daily life, Adams, thanks to the Enlightenment, also saw a human hand. There were no unintended consequences in the 18th century. If something had happened, something had caused it to happen, and Boston was now the victim of a more than decade-old plot on the part of the British ministry to enslave America, to drain this bounteous land of all her resources so that England, an island lost to luxury and corruption, could sustain the fraudulent lifestyle to which it had become accustomed. Nothing could sway Samuel Adams from these beliefs. No personal antagonism, and there were plenty, was enough to make him lose sight of the struggle for American liberty. He'd labored for more than a decade, writing articles and letters and attending meeting after meeting, but not until the fall of 1772, with the creation of the 21-member Boston Committee of Correspondence, did he find a way to link the fate of Boston to the entire province, and ultimately to all the colonies. And I really think it is with the creation of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, in which this was when Massachusetts included modern Maine, and there were 250 towns, and it was with the invention of this committee that sent open letters discussing the issues of the day to the town meetings of all these towns, that what had been a forum on local issues, and if any of you have attended a town meeting, I live on Nantucket, and I can tell you from experience that a town meeting can be a combative form of consensus. It's a very personal form of figuring out where we want to go. And with the Boston Committee of Correspondence sending letters to these town committees, they became forums on the issues of the day rather than bridge repair and widening roads. And what he had created with this was an independent form of communication outside the royal government in Massachusetts. And he had turned these town meetings into chat rooms that created forums that set into motion what would ultimately be the American Revolution. The leader who dominates the first part, Samuel Adams may have set the revolution in motion, but by the end of August 1774, he, along with his cousin John Adams and several other key revolutionary leaders, was on his way to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And as tensions mounted and violence threatened to erupt in Boston and the surrounding towns, a different kind of leadership was required. Emerging as the new de facto leader of the Patriot movement would be the 33-year-old physician, Joseph Warren. And here I'd like once again to read from Bunker Hill in my description of Joseph Warren. Whereas Samuel Adams was part political boss, part ideologue, Warren, close to 2 decades younger, possessed a swashbuckling personal magnetism. He'd been born in the nearby town of Roxbury, just across from Boston Neck, and as a boy he was often seen wandering the streets of Boston, selling milk from the family farm. The eldest of 4 brothers, Warren was recognized as an unusually gifted boy, and when he was 14 he began his studies at Harvard. In the fall of that year, his father was picking apples from the top of a tall ladder when he fell and broke his neck. Warren's youngest brother, John, had been just 2 years old at the time of this tragic event, and one of his first memories was of watching his father's lifeless body being carried away. With the financial help of family friends, Warren was able to continue at Harvard and later served as a kind of surrogate parent for his brothers, particularly for John, who had recently finished his medical apprenticeship with Warren and was now a doctor in Salem. At Harvard, Warren's talent for pursuing a dizzying variety of extracurricular activities was soon evident. Early on, he staged several performances of the popular politically themed play Cato in his dorm room, also a favorite of George Washington. The French and Indian War was then in full swing, and it seems that he joined the college's militia company. A classmate later told the story of how Warren responded to being locked out of a meeting of fellow students in an upper-story dormitory room. Instead of pounding at the door, he made his way to the building's roof, shimmied down a rain spout, and climbed in through an open window. Just as he was making his entrance, the rotted spout collapsed to the ground with a spectacular crash. Warren simply shrugged and commented that the spout had served its purpose. For a boy who had lost his father to a fatal fall, it was an illustrative bit of bravado. This was a young man who dared to do what should have, by all rights, terrified him. And I talk about how Warren developed an interest in medicine at Harvard, and would, during the smallpox of 1764, just as he was beginning his medical practice, would be involved in the inoculation of a large percentage of Bostonians and develop personal relationships almost immediately with a vast assortment of people, from loyalists to future patriots, across the economic spectrum. And he was, as a doctor, he was in a position to get to know the people of Boston in a very direct way that crossed all sorts of social boundaries. Although Warren always looked to Samuel Adams for guidance, he quickly established his own identity as a political leader, becoming in 1772 the moving spirit behind the North End Caucus, a group quietly organized to handpick the candidates for key positions in town and provincial government. Warren had that rarest of talents, the ability to influence the course of events without appearing to assert his own will, what one contemporary described as the wisdom to guide and the power to charm. There were other Patriot leaders who believed they were calling the shots, another contemporary later remembered, but it was really Warren through the North End Caucus, an organization that most Bostonians didn't even know existed, who controlled, quote, the secret springs that moved the great wheels. Warren was also a leading member of the St. Andrew's Lodge of Masons, that society that served as the clandestine nerve center of the Patriot movement. And he was just someone who was young and ambitious and charismatic and was tailor-made for the chaotic rush of events that would become the Revolution. Warren would, of course, die at the redoubt on Breed's Hill during the battle that also raises all sorts of questions about leadership or the lack thereof. As several observers made clear in letters and journal entries at the time, no American leader appeared to be in charge during this one-day battle that ended up having the best of all possible results for the Americans. When I was on the book tour for Bunker Hill, I was reading War and Peace, actually reading it on my phone, which was a real challenge. And I found that Tolstoy's description of the dynamics of battle to be highly relevant to what occurred on the Charlestown Peninsula on June 17, 1775. Tolstoy insists that the decisions made by generals have little ultimate impact on the outcome of a battle, which follows its own remorseless, if chaotic, sort of logic. A version of this occurred at Bunker Hill, and I'd like to return for the final time to my book in this introduction. After detailing how William Prescott, Israel Putnam, and John Stark did essentially their own thing in preparation for the British attack under the command of William Howe, meaning that no one was effectively in charge, I write, but the fact that no one was in charge wasn't necessarily all bad. There might be, in essence, 3 different commanders on the American lines, but as far as General Howe was concerned, they amounted to a single, very difficult-to-read enemy. In just the last hour, Howe, who was the British leader, had watched as the provincial fortifications organically evolved in ways of which not even he was entirely aware. Howe wasn't up against a leader with a plan to implement. He was watching 3 different leaders try to correct the mistakes of the other 2. The workings of this strange amalgam of desperation and internal one-upsmanship were baffling and a bit bizarre, but as Howe was about to discover, the end result was surprisingly formidable. It is with this baffling and bizarre example of how things seem to just happen, no matter how hard we puny mortals try to change the course of human events, that I'd like to begin my discussion with John Bell that will lead us, I'm sure, to the man of the hour, George Washington. Thank you.
Thanks, Nat. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to author Nathaniel Philbrick discussing the crisis of leadership in revolutionary America revealed by the Battle of Bunker Hill. My name is J.L. Bell, and I'm going to ask Nat Philbrick some questions about that busy summer of 1775 outside Boston and what it can tell us about the search for American leadership. I'll start by going back 2 months to the dramatic events of April 18th and 19th, 1775, and what do those days tell us about the Massachusetts leadership and especially about Dr. Joseph Warren?
Yeah, well, you know, the day of the shot heard round the world was one where, talk about an organic, chaotic movement. You know, and one of the things, Joseph Warren is the focus of a good portion of my book. And for example, he awakens in the morning, that morning, and hears that people have fallen in Lexington, and makes his way across and will eventually be in Lexington as the British, who have made it out to Concord, are now literally fighting their way house by house back to Boston. And, you know, what the British had not taken into account was the fact that these town militias, which had been galvanized by in the wake of the creation of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, could serve as a potential army for the revolutionary movement. And the spontaneity of, you know, these were cellular in their organization. And so when the word went out, when Paul Revere and William Dawes famously went out and alerted the countryside that the British were coming, you know, this was something that they were ready for, and that it was an outpouring of popular support that had no specific leader per se, except for the captain leading the militia, but they all knew enough that a system had been worked out through the efforts of Warren and many other provincial leaders by which not just Paul Revere and William Dawes, but a whole host of others participated in this getting the message out. It ignited a system that sort of went into place, and militiamen began to rush towards where they heard the British were. And so, and as the British made their way, there were the famous encounters at Lexington Green and on North Bridge in Concord, and the more you look into those, the more disordered they are. Clearly, no one was taking charge in those situations, and all sorts of misinformation, miscommunications erupted. And so it's, you know, what I came away with, it was not, you know, just noble militiamen rallying to the cry and defending American liberty. It was a series of, it was what the kind of life we lead today, of chaotic stream of events put into place by the alerting of the countryside, and all heck breaks loose. The British are there to find the arms. They never find much. And as they make their way back, what is begun as kind of an operation into the American hinterland becomes a desperate struggle back. And skirmishes begin to take on the aura of just a terrible form of warfare. You know, house by house, street by street, prisoners being executed. Just a horrible kind of civil war, really. And I think this frightened everyone and angered everyone, and provided the impetus that would really push New England in the direction that laid the groundwork for the Battle of Bunker Hill.
The beginning of war seems to have required a shift from this sort of collective decision-making in the town meetings and these committees and the North End Caucus to a more hierarchical decision-making with individual authority. And at the top of the army at first was Artemus Ward, who's a name you haven't mentioned as a major leader. What can you tell us about Artemus Ward and his leadership style?
Yeah, well, you know, I think Artemus Ward has gotten kind of a bum rap. He was someone who was essential at this time. You need someone to be in charge of a process by which it's really impossible to be and no one person can be in charge of revolutionary forces exploding. And he was attempting to provide the beginning of an army. An organized army, an almost impossible thing to do when it came to New Englanders of this time, thanks to town meetings in which people were used to having an input on when anything was decided. These were a group of Army privates who, when an officer told them to do something, they'd say, "Wait a minute. We're going to discuss whether we want to do this, and if we want to do this, we'd be happy to do what you've asked us to do." I mean, this is an attitude that it's very difficult to create a hierarchical army on the order of what they were up against with the British regulars. And so Artemus Ward was someone, he was not a swashbuckling, charismatic presence like Joseph Warren. He was suffering from kidney stones, I think it was, so he was feeling lousy all the time, but he was a man who did his duty. He showed up in the wake of this chaotic stream of militiamen arriving in Cambridge and Roxbury, and he began to put a command structure together. There were a lot of naysayers among the New England leaders who felt that he was not the man for the job. We need someone to take charge. But at this point, this was such a fluid event that if someone had said, "Okay, you're going to do it my way, the highway," many of these soldiers, and remember, it wasn't just Massachusetts. There were people coming from Connecticut. Oh my gosh, if you were from Massachusetts, someone from Connecticut was like a Martian arriving in good old Cambridge. New Hampshire, the same kind of thing. And so there were these groups that were uneasy in this alliance. And if there had been someone who came in strict and hard and said, "This is how we're going to do it," I think in those early stages it could have all just fractured and fallen away. And so I have to give Artemus Ward a lot of credit. I think he had his finger on the pulse of what, if you can call it a pulse, of what was going on. And even though he didn't look like perhaps he was doing much, the fact that he was there, sort of like Woody Allen says, you just show up is half the key to success. And Artemus Ward was this person who showed up and didn't get a lot of thanks for it in the aftermath of all this.
Now, in the middle of June 1775, Artemus Ward and his colleagues received word that the British are going to try to break out of their positions on the Boston Peninsula and possibly take other positions. And the word comes to their meeting place, which is in fact, the building no longer exists, but it was right across the street here. And how do they respond, and what does how does that lead into the fighting?
Well, it's a little murky, given what records have come to us. But what seems to have been the original plan was they wanted to delay, perhaps postpone this move by the British. And to do that, the idea was to build an earthen fort, a redoubt, on Bunker Hill. Now, Bunker Hill is very different from Breed's Hill, where the current Bunker Hill Monument is. I see confusion just plagues this whole scenario. And it's a half-mile back on the Charlestown Peninsula away from Boston. It would not, a structure there would not have threatened the British fleet in Boston Harbor. It would not have necessarily caused the British to say, we need an immediate response. It would have been, let's assess this, and could very easily have accomplished what was intended, and that was to delay, if not stop, this movement. For reasons that remain unclear, William Prescott, who led about a little over 1,000 soldiers at night across the neck onto the Charlestown Peninsula, in consultation with the colonel of artillery and apparently Israel Putnam, another officer from Connecticut, after a consultation, which one reference seems to imply was rather heated, Prescott built his fort not on Bunker Hill, but on Breed's Hill, a smaller hill much closer to the British, really just in the figurative face of the enemy. And so that when dawn arrived on June 17, 1775, and the British saw that here was a fort from which a cannon could potentially not only fire upon the British warships, but Boston itself, the decision was made, we need to respond now. And so instead of delaying the British, which seems to have been the intention of Artemus Ward and his family of officers, this, by building it on Breed's Hill, provoked a British response. And so this was something which Ward was not prepared for. And so this threw everything. Suddenly the British were hammering this redoubt with the cannons from the various ships anchored around the Charlestown Peninsula, and 2,000 British regulars were getting ready to invade the Charlestown Peninsula, and suddenly Ward was confronted with, now what do we do? And thus begins the chaotic beginnings of the Battle of Bunker Hill.
And this is a question which a lot of ink was spilled on in the 19th century. Who was in command on that peninsula?
Very good question, John. Who was in command? And I think, as I alluded to in the passage I read from, no one seems to have been in command. But there were three leaders who clearly were giving orders in their own localized part of the battlefield. Initially, there was William Prescott, who builds the redoubt, and then builds what is known when he realizes daylight comes and he says, "Whoa, my left is completely exposed to the enemy, who can just march up around my redoubt and let me have it. I need to build a breastwork," it was called, on my left. And so his men, as soon as daylight comes, begin to feverishly build this. And then at some point after that, soldiers primarily from Connecticut begin to realize, oh my gosh, there's a swampy area to the left of the breastwork, but now it's open all the way across the width of the peninsula to the Mystic River. Hey, here is a stone fence with the beginnings of a wooden fence atop it. Let's make what becomes known as the rail fence. And they feverishly begin to build the rail fence, which was a kind of sandwich construction with, and they were so desperate they used new mown hay to fill it in. And to the British, this looked like something that could withstand a cannon. But of course, a musket ball could go right through it, but it provided them with a buffer, a barrier behind which to fight, if nothing else. And so that's going on. And the cannonballs are flying all back and forth, hundreds, and then of provincial soldiers are pouring across the Charlestown neck to reinforce. And as this is all going on, Israel Putnam is also a part of this, and he seems to be everywhere. He's one of the few officers who has a horse, a long-tailed horse, we are told, and he is charging around and seems to, his main focus seemed to have building a fortification atop Bunker Hill, about a half mile behind Breed's Hill, perhaps as a fallback, because it was clear if Breed's Hill is taken, where are they going to go? There's nowhere to go. He requests and then basically takes all of the picks and shovels that the Prescott's men had been using to make their fortifications. He takes them up to Bunker Hill to work on that. And so he is doing that, and then we get Colonel Stark from New Hampshire arriving later in the going, and he is a grizzled New Englander of the archest sort, and he casts a cold eye upon what is going on, and sort of looks at the Prescott's redoubt and harumphs, and is not particularly impressed by what Israel Putnam's doing, looks at the rail fence and may have contributed to helping that, but sees a fatal flaw, an Achilles heel in all of this. That beside the Mystic River, there is a cliff, a ledge that goes down to the beach. A beach, and on this beach, the British could have sent the light infantry and basically get behind the American lines and attack them. And in fact, that is exactly what Howe was intending to do. Stark, at the last minute, orders his men to build a stone wall that plugs that gap. And so all of these officers are doing their own thing in the midst of this chaotic scene where Charlestown erupts in flames as the British set fire to that. 2,000 British regulars making their way across Boston Harbor on this sunny, windless summer day, while people on the roofs of Boston and on the hills surrounding this area are looking on as this incredible battle is about to unfold. And as I said before, no one, at least when it comes to the American side, seems to be in charge.
And where was Dr. Joseph Warren?
Well, Dr. Joseph Warren, at some point late in the going, makes his way, after checking in with Israel Putnam, makes his way to the redoubt and arrives late in the game, apparently dressed in his best suit, and is met with cheers and takes up his position there. He apparently wanted to be where the action was, and of course that vicinity is where he would die toward the end of this battle.
And yes, well, how did the battle end for the Americans? What was accomplished and what was not accomplished?
Well, it's one of those things. You could not come up with a scenario that would be a better result for the Americans, in which, yes, they lose this battle. The British, after three charges, suffer casualties of close to 50%. Almost, close to 1,000 British soldiers are killed or injured. And these were horrible injuries where the Americans were, if they didn't say fire till you see the whites of their eyes, were waiting to the last possible moment, making those musket balls have their maximum effect. And there weren't just musket balls loaded into those muskets. There were just awful things, rocks and pieces of rusted iron, and that made horrible injuries. And so half the British are lost, and yet they take the redoubt and send the provincial soldiers in harum-scarum retreat, running back across the neck back into Cambridge, and they lose the battle. No one in the chaos sees what happened to Joseph Warren. It is only later established that he indeed was lost in the final stages of it. But and to leaders, to civil leaders in Watertown and Cambridge, they're just going, what the heck is going on here? This is chaos. Artemus Ward is he was accused of hanging out in his quarters and not being there on the battlefield. But wait a minute, what was he going to do? The British could very easily have used this as a feint and attacked in Roxbury on the other side of Boston, or even gone up the Charles River to Cambridge. He had a tremendous amount of space to cover, and he needed to keep some of his men in reserve in case this happened, or all would be lost. And so, but he did not provide that spectacle of someone up there in harm's way. He was not a Joseph Warren, and so he became an easy target, accused of cowardice and ineffective lassitude. But I really think he was doing just about all he could do, given what a left turn this battle had taken very early on in the day. And so it was an American defeat. There were many American naysayers said, if we had had someone like a Washington here, this could have been as great as Lexington and Concord and been the victory that won us this conflict. But in actuality, this worked out about as well as it could. As Nathaniel Green from Rhode Island would say, if we could sell the British another hill at the cost of Bunker Hill, we'd be glad to do it.
Meanwhile, as the storytellers say, in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was on those very same days appointing a new commander-in-chief for this army, and it was going to take responsibility for the New England Army. And who was that commander-in-chief, and what military background did he bring? Why did they choose him, of all people?
George Washington, of course. Well, if there was only one person wearing a military uniform at the Continental Congress, and that's a pretty good hint. But no, seriously, Washington had. Compared to your average British general, he was not did not have deep military experience. He had been a Virginian planter for the decades prior to this. But as a young man, he had been at the center of action. Basically, he was responsible for beginning the French and Indian War. Although I write a lot about maritime and New England topics, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and so I grew up with Braddock Avenue and the Three Rivers and all of that history, and that's where Washington was, not only in the series of skirmishes with the French that would bring on the French and Indian War, but he was there with Braddock, and it's a miracle he survived, but he did, and he saw a lot in these battles and seems to have learned a lot in these battles. And he wanted nothing more than to be a British officer, and he never received that invitation, and thus was ceded Washington's future as an American military leader. And so his experience was in the past, but one of Washington's greatest assets was his appearance. I mean, he looked like a leader. He was tremendously tall for his time. He was 6.5 feet tall at a time when most people were a foot less. He had that look. He was not a braggart by any means. He had, earlier I described Warren's ability to speak with people and subtly turn them around to his own way of thinking without them realizing he was doing that. Abigail Adams would basically say the same thing of George Washington later on. He had that ability to seemingly passively emerge from a group as the center of focus, and that was really how he emerged from the Continental Congress to be named the commander. I mean, John Adams takes credit in his memoirs for Washington, for putting Washington's name forward, being from Virginia. That was an astute move, because the concern among many colonies outside New England was that these New Englanders who had started this revolution might use it as an excuse to defeat the British there, and then, because they were known for their warrior status throughout the series of French and Indian wars that began with King Philip's War in the previous century and went on for 100 years, they were experienced fighters, what compared to most colonists. And the fear was that they were going to then turn what began as a revolution and a war and turn the war against the colonies to the south and take over the British colonies. That was the fear. And by by giving the command to Washington, a Virginian, that helped lay those fears to rest.
Our picture of Washington is often based on him as president, which was many years after this. When he came to here to Cambridge, he was only 43 years old. What other experiences did he bring besides his early wartime experience? Had he done anything else that would prepare him for leadership?
Well, he had managed a very large plantation, a very complex organism. And, and it involved him in a daily process of giving orders, of looking at what needed to be done and making it happen. And he was used to a hierarchical society, really, where, people did what you told them to. He had a large number of slaves, obviously, on his plantation. But it went farther than being simply a slave master. He had this was a very complicated economic entity that he was in charge of, and it involved economic relations with British merchants, and he was also served in politically, and so he was wired into that side of things. He was not known particularly for his being an outspoken political leader, but he was someone who always seemed to be there and quietly could listen, didn't have a lot to say, but when he did speak, people respected what he said. And so he had an aura about him that was reassuring in a way and full of authority. And I think it's kind of interesting, after Bunker Hill, where things are just coming out of left field every other day, events are cascading, and it's all threatening to just, go insane in a vortex of incredible change. Washington is a different kind of personality, completely. Someone, that rock around which the stream is forced to flow. And he was, a different kind of person when it came to what New Englanders had seen with Joseph Warren and Samuel Adams.
Massachusetts politicians had asked for Virginia commander. In fact, John Adams had asked for Washington. Washington had clearly wanted the job, and then in July 1775, he arrives here. Everybody gets what they want, and do they like it?
No, particularly Washington. Washington was very disappointed is putting it mildly. He was horrified by what he found. I mean, he came up here, and this was a group of soldiers that many of them wearing exactly what they had on when they left their farms on the night of April 18th. And they had not washed since. They literally smelled, they were dirty, and they had that New Englander's talent for only listening to themselves when it came to doing that. They and New Englanders were not the only ones, but they clearly enjoyed their rum. This was part of it. They were remarkably pious. They prayed relentlessly every Sunday. But they were a combustible group, literally. In fact, the muskets kept going off. More people were getting injured through self-inflicted gunshot wounds than anything else during much of the siege. And Washington looked at this, and he had come to believe that the Battle of Bunker Hill had been won by these grizzled, disciplined New England militiamen who had, fought the British, and he realizes this is just madness. This is a group of farmers who are getting increasingly restless, and the whole problem is what to do next. Washington wants to turn this group into a professional army. They, being militiamen, and have been having lived in an area that had more than a century-long tradition of where people served temporarily. You signed up for 9 months, and when that was over, no matter what was going on, you went home, largely because you were a farmer, and if you didn't get home, your family would starve to death. And most of Washington's army the time was ticking. they would be up at the end of the year. And so Washington looks at this and says, what am I supposed to do with these people that have no sense of what authority should do? And so some of his letters back home, which seem to have gotten spilled to others, were really critical of the New Englanders. And this created a real tension between Washington and the men he was trying to lead.
And Washington also had big plans. How did those work out?
Yeah, well, Washington, as you alluded to earlier, John, Washington is someone, if you've seen Washington on the dollar bill, you think of him as that marble man, the statue with some dust on top of his white hair, looking stoically at you and making you do what you're going to do. But Washington was not yet this kind of leader. He was young. He was in his early 40s. He looked at this group of militiamen who were all going to leave him potentially by the end of the year, and he was not content with a stalemate, what would become the siege of Boston. He wanted to attack. He wanted to get this over with. He was convinced that if there wasn't one brilliant stroke that won this thing, it could all just simply fall apart. Because he was quite right in realizing how unstable all of this was. So Washington had a fiery side that he had always done his best, particularly in his more mature years, to subdue. But it was still there, and what he wanted to do was attack Boston. To send his army into the streets of Boston, fight house to house, potentially burn the city down, and defeat the British and get this thing over with. The Continental Congress had made it clear that before Washington could do anything like this, he had to confront his Council of War. And every time Washington would bring up proposals of this kind, and he would repeatedly bring them up from the fall of 1775 into the winter of 1776, they would, till the very end, turn him down. And one of the things I say in this book is probably a good thing they did. They did not have the artillery, the gunpowder they needed. The men were not a highly trained group of soldiers, and that could have easily resulted in the annihilation of his army, rather than in a terrible defeat, rather than the victory that won everything.
Washington was able to take some initiatives during the siege. What were some of his more important decisions?
Well, there are a series of things, and it's interesting watching Washington work. I mean, and he was angering many of the militiamen because what he wanted to, there's a new general in town, and he codified what was going on. You had to wear, if not a uniform, at least signs of what your rank was. Also, the Cambridge smelled horribly, so sanitation was something he quickly began to address. All sorts of regulations began to pour out of Cambridge here, and changing things, and he went about this and one of the great problems he had inherited really from the Battle of Bunker Hill had to do with the artillery regiment. It had been an embarrassment at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The officers whose greatest abilities were the fact that they were related to the colonel, meant that when the battle began, many of them fled the battlefield without bringing their cannons to play in the battle. And and Israel Putnam in particular blamed the officers of the artillery regiment by their cowardly behavior, inciting the other soldiers to follow their example and creating this kind of this chaotic retreat. And so Washington needed to clean house when it came to the artillery regiment. But what to do? Who to go with? It was clear that there were some officers from Massachusetts who considered that they should be next in line. But it was early in the fall. By the fall of 1775, Washington had been met and impressed by a young officer, 25-year-old Henry Knox, and who freely admitted that the only thing he knew about artillery came from the books he sold in his bookstore, and God bless booksellers. And it shows you that book learning can go a long way. But he was smart. He was physically of Washington stature, if not quite, but of the roly-poly sort. And he seems to have had just a winning way about him. And he caught Washington's eye. And John Adams once again comes into the conversation and becomes involved in following Washington's lead or initiating it and saying, how about Henry Knox to lead the artillery regiment? Now, this was kind of an outrageous thing to do. A 25-year-old bookseller is going to become the head of the artillery regiment. And if this was announced to this unruly group of militiamen, all heck was going to break loose among his officers. And so he was really smart about this. He decides in November of 1775 to send Henry Knox on a secret mission to go 300 miles to the north to Fort Ticonderoga and bring back the dozens of cannon that are there and somehow get them to Boston, because if they were going to force the British out, they needed artillery. Knox quietly goes off, bringing in his younger brother in on this, and up they go. And while he's up there, word comes out that the new colonel of artillery will be none other than Henry Knox. There's a firestorm. What? You cannot believe? What? And so, and some of the letters are just horrific. And I won't name names, but read John's blog if you want to get those. But it was, it all happened. But Henry Knox wasn't there. And in January of 1776, he arrives with those 50 sledges, pulled by horses and cattle, bearing these tons and tons of cannon that have made their way down the Hudson, on the ice, across the width of Massachusetts, to Framingham, and then ultimately to Dorchester Heights. And so it's clear that this guy has some abilities, and he begins the difficult work of turning this artillery regiment into what will become a crack outfit.
And how does that help end the siege of Boston and this first campaign of the war?
Well, it was almost more symbolic, really, than anything, because, the fact of the matter is they didn't have much gunpowder. And so if they were and cannons require quite a bit of gunpowder, a lot more than a musket. And if you're going to get yourself into a shooting match with cannon, it requires a lot of gunpowder, and they didn't have any. So it was really a game of leading the British to appear that we were a lot stronger than we were. And the strategy that led to that was the famous building of fortifications atop Dorchester Heights, where just a handful of those cannons were placed and made the British realize that artillery from this peak could have a devastating impact, not only on the soldiers in Boston, but in the fleet in the surrounding Boston harbor.
And so that brings us to the end of the siege of Boston. What did General Washington learn about being a general during those months, and what did the Continental Army and the Continental Congress and the people of America learn about General Washington?
What did Washington learn? It's interesting. The more I look into it, he got a huge dose of reality, and we all need this. Any leader can have plans, and inevitably those plans do not work out as planned. And Washington from that realized that, how this whole siege of Boston turned out was basically contrary to the plan he had. His plan was to attack. His plan was to take this by force and win it all with one brilliant stroke. But it didn't go that way. And almost contrary to him, the winning strategy had been taking the artillery to Dorchester Heights, a plan, by the way, that was originally, if it can be attributed to anyone, was none other than Artemus Ward, which gets lost. Washington only reluctantly agreed to do that. So, and even at the end, Washington was basically angry that was the strategy that had made this happen. He was hopeful that the British were going to attack him on Dorchester Heights, and he had ready hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers ready up the Charles to come down in boats and attack Boston at Boston Common and create and come through the back door. I mean, this was nuts because the British were completely dug in. It could have annihilated the army just as it's one of those what ifs. It never happened because Howe, after being tempted to attack Dorchester Heights, a storm came and he realized, what am I doing here? We just want to leave anyways. He backed off and it was agreed to leave. But what did Washington learn from that? I don't know if he learned a lot. And as will be revealed, in New York, much of what he wanted to do in Boston, he would repeat there to no good effect. He still had a lot of learning to do. And I think one of the fundamental things about a good leader is that they are able to change, that they are able to say, wait a minute, okay, this is what I want to do, but it's not what I'm going to be able to do. What should I do as a consequence of that? That is very hard. A lot of people just blow up and say, the heck with this. If I'm not going to do it my way, I'm not the man for the job. Washington realized that there really wasn't anyone else for the job. And it's interesting, even at this early time in Boston, and by December of 1775, he's writing letters to Joseph Reed, who's at this stage briefly a kind of confidant, and where he's talking about just these kinds of issues. Okay, so if I can't do this, maybe I should do that. And please tell me what they're saying in Continental Congress. Let me know the bad stuff they're saying so that I can adjust myself to make things work. I mean, that is remarkable. That is the ultimate sense of personal confidence, that you're asking for input, much of it negative, and willing to listen to it to make yourself a better leader. And that would be Washington's great strength. But I think, one of the other thing, he was pig-headed. He would follow this strategy that he wanted to implement in Boston for months in the future when it came to the whole New York and Long Island campaign. But that very doggedness, I think, meant that when he did begin to realize that that strategy wasn't going to work, once he had begun to change his attitude, that doggedness contributed to his ability to keep hanging in there throughout it all. And that, I think, is really his most miraculous quality, his sheer ability to endure hardship, not lose hope, even though he clearly by his letters there were times when he pretty much had lost hope, but he continued to stay at it, and that is a remarkable characteristic.
You're listening to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion with Nathaniel Philbrick on Bunker Hill and the crisis of leadership in revolutionary America. At this point in the program, we'll take questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone here and limit yourself to one well-phrased question. And our first questioner here is Dr. Sam Foreman, who has written a biography of Dr. Joseph Warren.
Mr. Philbrick, in Bunker Hill, you have shined a bright light on the reality and a good part of the creation myth of the what came to be the United States of America. And in these past months, you've talked to a variety of audiences around the country and even further afield. In reflecting on that, and looking back over these last few months and your book, is there anything in the book that you would have emphasized, de-emphasized, or changed if you were to write it today?
Yeah, well, first off, Samuel Foreman's excellent biography of Joseph Warren was absolutely fundamental to my own research process. So, and if you haven't read it, you got to get it. It is a great biography. And you know, every book I write, I go through a period, particularly after, of going, oh my gosh, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? You know, there's all sorts of ways you could look at events and all that. And inevitably, and that's the initial sort of 3 or 4 months of shaking my head. Usually that's just before it gets published. And then it gets published, and I go through, you know, the process you just described. And talk about the book and learn to talk about the book, because that's a totally different process from writing the book. And then I begin to settle down a bit and begin to think, okay, now what would you change? And what I've begun to realize is, yes, there are things I would have changed clearly. I'm not going to necessarily go into them right now, but what I would say is this. It would one of the things that novelists, for example, my father is a James Fenimore Cooper expert and now retired, and he is in a process, along with other scholars, editing Cooper novels. And Cooper had a tendency to write the novel and then 10 years later return to it and revise it. And inevitably, the revisions just make it a worse novel. They blunt the edges. And they make it, you know, you're not in that same spontaneous act of creation. And for me, my books are not strictly quantitative analyses of something. They are an attempt to evoke a time. And involved in that is the process I go through, which is very much a kinetic involvement with the sources and sort of making it happen. And from experience, you know, I know once I begin to muck with that, I create issues that then just don't necessarily clarify or make it better. So besides a few minor tucks and nips and stuff like that, I think I'm going to, you know, it's pretty much what it is. Thank you, Sam.
Who is Nathaniel Green, and when did he appear on the scene?
Well, Nathaniel Green made a remarkable transformation from a private to a general. I don't know if anyone has ever made that leap, but he was from Rhode Island, raised as a Quaker, but as Melville describes the Nantucketers, he was a Quaker with a vengeance, in which he embraced the art of war. He was highly organized, incredibly articulate. His letters are terrific. And young, in his early 30s, but one of those guys, very similar to Henry Knox, in that he had just an intuitive love and ability when it came to this kind of activity. And Washington, he was one of the few officers that Washington saw some potential in. His men were organized, were clean, had tents. They looked like a professional army, and he quickly became part of Washington's extended family and someone he would trust. And along with Knox would be with Washington for the duration of the war. And his letters, I find, are extremely instructive when it comes to what is going on, what are people thinking, and tracking his letters to his family back in Rhode Island, you can see how the officers during the fall of 1775 are beginning to think, this isn't about our beef with Parliament. This is the only thing that's going to work is independence, because up until this time, this was not what this was all about. And you can see through his letters that this is what they're talking about. By December, this is what they're saying. And then, of course, would come Thomas Paine's Common Sense and what would eventually lead to the Declaration of Independence in the summer of 1776. But Green is someone that I find is a fascinating figure that would be absolutely essential to Washington in the future. Thank you.
My name is Warren Little. I'm happy to be representing the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati here tonight. As the fourth great-grandson of one of the artillery officers you referred to, I might comment that Henry Knox not only learned from the books that he sold, but also from the books that he borrowed and were loaned to him and never returned. That's another whole story. If I remember correctly, there was some real unhappiness when you talk about leadership amongst the ranks of the handed out to the officers, to the generals at the time. And I wondered if you might comment on this. Is that a clear question?
Well,
The officers received questions as to what ranks of generals.
Right.
And there was a good deal of unhappiness about
Yes.
this, and I thought it might be interesting to
Yeah,
comment
it
on
is. And it's, and this would be a problem that would plague the officer corps for the entire revolution. It was, for an officer, rank was everything. And it still is in the military. And it was, who outranks whom. And if someone, just because someone is a better at it than the other does not necessarily mean they should outrank someone. And so this became a very contentious issue, complicated by the fact that you had, this wasn't really one army yet. You had Connecticut, you had, each of the colonies that became states had their own sort of pecking order of generals. And once it became more of an American army, this created a very complex source of controversy, as someone would say, as the Continental Congress would say, well, Connecticut has 3 generals, we can't, we got to give some to South Carolina. And to those serving, it just seemed insane, and yet there was a certain logic there. And so it was a constant battle within the officer corps, a jockeying of who is who, and I outrank you on all of this, and it was a huge diversion to Washington, who really just wanted to fight this war when half the time he seemed to be fighting with his generals.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could help us understand what was going through the minds on the other side. And I'm particularly interested in General Howe and what he was like before and after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then how that affected his leadership when he took over for Gage.
Yes. Well, William Howe is, it's almost Shakespearean. I mean, he really is one of these enigmatic characters. He was described as, sort of dark hair, black eyes, didn't talk a lot, had a reputation, though, as one of the great tacticians of the regular army, of coming up with, because this was a time when armies would clash on the open field, that your ability to move lines and columns of soldiers around was key when it came to the tactics and strategy of a battle. And he was regarded as one of the top. He had served was distinction during the French and Indian War. In fact, he was one of those who clawed up the cliffs in Quebec and was there when Wolfe died so tragically, and his brother had died at Ticonderoga during the French and Indian War. And I was just in England a couple of weeks ago and made the pilgrimage to where the Massachusetts was so felt indebted to Howe's brother that a monument is at Westminster Cathedral is there, and it's big too. I mean, it must have been a lot of money that the Massachusetts was willing to put up for, and this is in the 1760s, and imagine it, 15 years later, his younger brother is there leading the army as they march up Breed's Hill. He would, he would be criticized for the strategy he would follow. There were Clinton, another general, said, let's go the backdoor route, cut off their retreat on the Charlestown Neck, and then put them in a bag and annihilate the army. He went for a more direct approach, with the caveat that he was going to send his light infantry along that beach. That was the hole that was then plugged by Stark. And when that didn't work out, it became this brutal wave of assaults, 3 assaults. And Howe, surrounded by his staff, including a servant with a bottle of wine, led his men. He literally led his men into battle. Every member of his staff would be killed or wounded, and there were officers on both sides who would comment on how Howe stood all alone by himself on the verge of the American line in the midst of one of these charges. And as he would admit in a letter soon after the battle, it was in the midst of the early stages of this battle that he experienced a feeling I had never felt before, which is an extraordinary thing for someone of Howe's personality to express. He would make his way back down for that final charge. They would take the redoubt and win the Battle of Bunker Hill, even if it was a Pyrrhic victory. But there were those, and you know, hindsight is a wonderful thing, where you see there the makings of his future. And I think you have to be a little leery of that. But there were many people, other officers, particularly Charles Lee, who would say that it was at the Battle of Bunker Hill that Howe experienced profound change. Later, in the Battle of Brooklyn, when really through a brilliant end run, he was poised to defeat Washington's army before it had a chance to cross the East River into Manhattan. All it took was one final push up a hill, and he refrained. He didn't want to have the casualties. And some have said it was the Battle of Bunker Hill that changed him. I think it's a little more complex than that. I think Howe and his brother, who was the admiral who would be leading the Navy, they were political moderates, and they didn't feel the Americans should necessarily be defeated. They were hoping for some kind of reconciliation, and were leery of the knockout punch that would turn them into a defeated and angry people. Of course, that would be for no purpose, but that may have also contributed to that decision. But clearly, the Battle of Bunker Hill had a deep and lasting influence on his character as a military leader.
Another great grandson here, Colonel James Barrett of Concord. Your talk is about leadership. One of our family's myths or facts, we hope it's a fact, that he was instrumental in the countercharge. I know the British were going out there to his munitions factory that he had on his farm, but didn't he kind of lead the charge that day back down towards the bridge? And he lost his nephew that day, too.
Yeah, I mean,
Nathaniel, I think his name was.
Right. Well, he was, if there was a leader at the North Bridge, he was it. But it was clear that, you know, this was, just imagine this. No one really knew at this point at Concord what had happened in Lexington. You know, so no one really knew that things were in play. There's this indecision. What are we doing here? Are we trying to incite conflict? What is our job? Are we here just to sort of protect our town? Are we here to, attack the British? No one knew, and there was discussion, and what would spark the shot heard round the world would be misinformation. There was a fire broke out in Concord by accident, and the British threw water on the fire to put it out, causing a cloud of smoke to go up. The Americans over on the other side of the river think, oh my gosh, the British are burning our town. We have to go save it. And so hence the confrontation at the North Bridge. The opposite was the case, but so it goes in war. And that's what sparked it. And so, it was clearly, and so that confrontation occurs, then what? What do? Do you continue fighting? Barrett would retreat basically with some men, while others would go to the other side. And eventually, as the British, as we all know, began to retreat and head back to Boston, the whole Battle Road scenario would unfold. But I think your ancestor is an example of how difficult this was, and how the leaders that emerged were the people that were the leaders in the community under circumstances that were not necessarily warfare, that were just living. And so he was one of them that made it happen. Great. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for your comments and for your book. I wondered, I know you've touched on it, but can you take me to the battle, immerse me in the sights and sounds of the battle for at least a few minutes, or a minute, and describe the chaos and what the experience was like for the anonymous fighters and the carnage afterwards?
Yeah. Well, warfare at this time was really personal in a way that it isn't. Warfare is always personal, but it was close. The engagements were then, and so the Americans were dug in across the width of the Charlestown Peninsula. Some of them in the redoubt, some of them behind the breastworks, some of them along the rail fence, and then even those others behind the stone wall that Stark had created. And here they are. They're behind there, and it's hot, and they've been digging. They're sweating. Those in the redoubt have been there since the previous night. They're hungry. They're really, really thirsty. And they're scared because they're watching 2,000 British regulars make their way across Boston Harbor, being rowed on this beautiful sunny day, their bayonets glinting in the sun, as thousands of civilians are watching from the roofs and steeples of Boston, from the hills, the surrounding towns, as all of this unfolds. We have a wonderful letter from British General John Burgoyne describing the jangled nerves that everyone had, the sense of anticipation as they're watching. What the fate of the English-speaking world may be decided in what transpires next. Howe leads his men up in what was described as a straggling line as the British make their way up the hill towards the Americans dug in. This is not a golf course they are going over. It's full of rocks. It's long hay that's basically in many up to their waists, and it's lined with very irritating fences everywhere, so that this formation upon which the British strategy is based gets stopped whenever they have to pull apart these fences and continue on. And the Americans are just sitting there waiting. And so this is all going as the British are sweating their way up the hill in their woolen uniforms. It's not until they're 50, even 30 yards from the American line. And at that stage, people can hear what people are saying. Can you imagine the anxiety, the tension, as all of this is, with just the sounds of drums and fifes as they're making their way up, and then within 30 yards, the musket balls are unleashed from the American muskets. This is described by some as like popcorn popping and clouds of smoke as the British soldiers begin to fall. And there are the Americans, and these people are not professional soldiers. No one has been in a situation like this. Some of them have been in the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, but those were moving. Those were moving from house to house. Here, they're dug in, with nowhere to go. And what everyone is terrified of is the awesome spectacle of a British bayonet charge, where the tactic is you fire, and out of the British smoke come these big British soldiers with their high hats, making them seem even larger, with their bayonets thrust before them, charging and screaming. It's enough to terrify anyone. However, because of that initial volley, they are driven back. The British officers are very upset that the soldiers stopped to fire rather than prepare and do that bayonet charge. They're forced to do it over again. And remember, the Americans know they do not have much gunpowder. And it's frustrating because behind them, up on Bunker Hill, they can see hundreds, if not thousands, of their compatriots basically just milling around, not coming to their aid. And so they're going, what the heck is going on here? And many of them are saying, are we being left to die? The second charge occurs. Pretty much the same thing. The British are staggered and come back. And then now everyone on the American side knows we have hardly any gunpowder left. And here they come again. And the one added factor is while all of this is happening, the town of Charlestown is burning. It's an inferno, sending this pall of smoke across the battlefield. And it's this bright form of heat. And as one British officer would say, it was the hottest battle, any of them. And some of these guys were grizzled veterans of the European wars from the 7 Years' War. It was the hottest. It was not only the hottest temperature from the fires of Charlestown in the summer day, it was also the hottest fire any of them had experienced. And so up they go for that final charge. And on this final one, the British that are approaching the redoubt are shouting out, "Conquer or die, conquer or die." And finally, when they finally make it through and are now on at the base of the redoubt, they've got their swords in one hand, their muskets in the other, and up they come. By now, the Americans are throwing rocks because they've run out of gunpowder. They pick up their barrels of their guns and begin to use them as clubs as the British come over. And the British cannot believe. It's contrary to usual military protocol for people to remain in a redoubt as that's coming over. Usually you're long gone, but there they are. And so the smoke inside the redoubt is blinding. It's dark. You can't see a thing. And they are punching, they're stabbing as Americans flow out and just run pell-mell towards the neck in the safety of Cambridge. And so all of this is happening. No one knows what is going on. They're terrified. This is the turning point in which what had begun as supposedly an ideologically driven thing goes from a few skirmishes to out and out war.
Thank you. I'm getting pretty worked up hearing that description. I'm ready to go out and join the battle almost. Thanks. First of all, I'm just curious, were the British soldiers mostly or entirely mercenaries? But then what I really got up to ask about, right outside this window in the old burying ground here is a stone marker to somebody who died as a result of wounds at Bunker Hill, if I'm not mistaken. It can be seen from the sidewalk that runs along the beginning of Garden Street. And I wonder if you could comment about that or any other markers that you know of right here. And then there's another stone tablet over by Littauer near the Harvard Law School, which commemorates, was he a Colonel Putnam joining with something like 1,600 men in prayer before going over to Bunker Hill. So right here, just within yards of where you're talking, are these that took place right here, and I just wonder if you could comment on any of those or others that you know of.
Well, thank you. For me, the part of my research process is going to the places. I never quite know how much of it gets into the book, but it's part of it makes if once I have a sense of the geography and the topography, it provides a mental space in which I can then inhabit with the characters and the unfolding of events. And you're absolutely right. We are here in the midst of where history occurred. I mean, imagine this green. This was full of soldiers as in the morning of June 1775, they realized we've got a battle on our hands. We've got to get soldiers out there. So the word has gone out, and companies are running from the structures around here. You know, the dormitories of Harvard were barracks for the soldiers, as were some of the churches, and they're running out, putting on, you know, many of them don't have uniforms, most of them don't. One company that did have uniforms realized, hey, we're going to be the only ones out there with a uniform, so they put their old ratty clothes on the outside of their uniforms just so they would be less conspicuous during the battle. That sort of shows you where the Americans were coming from in all this. But, you know, this is where it was all happening. And, you know, for me, so much of the research process has been getting historic maps of Cambridge. You know, there's some wonderful ones, all of them pretty much made by the British, who had a long time to work at them during the siege. But I blew them to poster size and had them sprinkled around my desk, and with a marker would, you know, make notes to myself, and I also used them when it came to trying to figure out where people lived in Boston, and, you know, and if they went from here to there, how would they have gone, that kind of thing. But when it comes to the battle, you know, the Bunker Hill Monument is a tremendously moving memorial. The book I wrote prior to this, The Last Stand, about the Battle of Little Bighorn, I've now been to that battlefield 7 times. And each time I go to a place, particularly before I write the book, it's a process of just getting the general lay of the land. It's after a first draft that I begin to know enough that I have specific questions that I want to answer, specific places I want to see. And so that's when going to the places becomes tremendously important to me. Sadly, while I was writing Bunker Hill, my uncle was suffering an illness from which he would eventually die. And I was sort of the designated person to visit him at Spalding Rehab right here. And so much of my time while I was working on that book was beside Uncle Chuck. And but I would then, to get out, would walk around here. And it really is remarkable when you're in the midst of writing a scene such as the battle scene, to go to the place. And even though it bears little resemblance to what it once was, you know, with street buses and cars and trucks, and there is something about the land that makes us realize people were here at that time, and we are people now, and there is something vital that connects all of us. Thank you.
Yeah. Last question.
Okay, all right. Can you talk a little bit about the propaganda aspect of the battle in terms of when word got back to England and just I mean, the British lost,
yeah,
they had no idea they would lose this many men, and
right.
You know, there were a lot of British politicians who said this is a wasted effort, almost like our fiasco in Vietnam, and and how that really, this whole battle really affected, I mean, the British, a lot of them got buried, I guess, central burial ground, unmarked graves, and the British were trying to cover up, I guess, what they had suffered at this battle, although they didn't, as you said, it was a Pyrrhic victory for them.
Yeah, well, it was a propaganda campaign, and this was one of Warren's great strengths. He was, immediately after Lexington and Concord, was elected president of the Provincial Congress. He would be the leading personage in the Committee of Safety, which was effectively the executive branch of the provincial government. So he had both sides covered, and one of his the first responsibilities was to win the propaganda aftermath of Lexington and Concord. And the way to do that was to have the best and most thorough account, the most convincing account, and get it to England first. Because really the 900-pound gorilla in all of this was the Atlantic Ocean. It's 3,000 miles wide. It takes more than a month for a ship to get across it. Once it gets to Britain, it takes about another month for Parliament and the King to figure out the ministry, what they're going to do. And then it takes more than a month to come back. You know, so that's at least a 3-month lag. And in a revolution, things by definition happen quickly. And so that the British were responding, to things that had long ago no longer applied. And so they were always behind it. And Warren and other provincial leaders after Lexington and Concord went out and interviewed people, militiamen who were at Lexington and Concord, and even British soldiers who had been captured. And their they were interviewed. It was written down. Their testimony was written down, and this was all assembled into an account that was, of course, more than a little one-sided, but it was very thorough, very complete, and they knew that General Gage, who was then the leader of the British forces, had already sent out his account, but they also knew he had sent his account on a vessel known as the Suki, which was not particularly fast vessel. New Englanders were mariners and recognized that if we go with a smaller schooner and we don't put a cargo in her but give her the ballast, use ballast stones to give her just the right ballast, just the right trim, we should be able to beat this ship. So they took a little more time, got it right, sent her out, Captain Derby, and on the Cuero, she was called, secretly left Salem, and she did not just pass the Suki, she put almost a month between her. I mean, it was weeks. And so this Salem captain arrives in London with this typeset account that is, without any response. The British ministers go, okay, now don't worry, this couldn't have happened. We're going to get Gage's account, and we'll get this. But week after week goes by. The British ministers are so frustrated. One of them even sent a letter to Gage, even though, where is it? Even though they knew it was going to. Finally, it arrives in June, but by then it had been lost. And unfortunately, he had a different slant, but he describes the same thing. And already the Americans now have the advantage in the propaganda campaign, and thus it would go a slowly unfolding nightmare for the British government. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, recorded in December 2013, co-sponsored by the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this radio program entitled Bunker Hill and the Crisis of Leadership in Revolutionary America, featuring author Nathaniel Philbrick, and about our ongoing radio series and YouTube webcasts, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm J.L. Bell. Thanks for joining us.